So if you've watched this channel for a little while, then you know I love Canon cameras, the DJI Ronin 4D, and Lumix cameras. For a lot of my documentary work, I use the Ronin 4D and the Canon C400 with some of the Canon mirrorless hybrids. And for a lot of my fun work or shorter branded content pieces, I love Lumix because of the incredible IBIS and just the amount of features they pack into such a small camera body. But every once in a while, I like to check out the other camera brands to make sure there's nothing that I'm missing. And recently, I rented the brand new Sony A7V as well as the Nikon ZR to see how they stack up against my usual camera systems. So today we're gonna look at all of these cameras in 9 different categories to see which one works best for people like me, primarily video shooters who also do a little bit of photo on the side. So let's dig into which of these full frame, mid-range mirrorless hybrids is the best value for the dollar. If you're new here, my name is Curtin Sheldon, and I'm an Oscar-nominated filmmaker and ASC award-winning cinematographer. I just launched a members-only version of this YouTube page, which has a lot of behind-the-scenes content as well as footage dumps, early access to videos, and for the higher tier of member, there is a 90-minute full documentary interview lighting course. So consider becoming a member. It really helps support the channel and allows me to keep doing videos like this one. All right, let's put these cameras to the test. So for me, the most important thing for any camera is the video quality. I'm a filmmaker, I do mostly documentary film, but also shoot branded content commercials and fiction films as well. And so when I'm looking for a mirrorless hybrid, I want something that does a little bit of everything. I do quite a bit of photography as well, but definitely is not my main source of income. It's really just for fun. So I'll touch on photos a little bit near the end of this video, but primarily we're gonna be focused on the video features and video quality of these 4 cameras. Now, I have historically been a Canon shooter. Those were my first cameras. I've used the C100, the C200, the C300, the C70, which is shooting me now, and I'm currently shooting a feature documentary on the C400 and C50. So I'm very comfortable with Canon, and I've used them for a long time, and the Canon R6 III, which is basically a almost identical twin to the C50 with just a few modifications. And then I've also, over the years, used Lumix quite often. I first grabbed the GH5 because I needed a small gimbal cam to go with my red Helium that also shot 4K and 10-bit 422, and it was really the only mirrorless camera at the time that could do that. And since Lumix has now put a lot of their efforts into full frame, I have loved their full frame cameras. The S1H was just an incredible camera, one of the first mirrorless cameras to be Netflix approved, and I've used on a lot of shoots as well. Their newest models, the Panasonic S1 II and S1 II, are also beautiful cameras, and I'm using both of them as a B and C cam to my Ronin 4D on another feature documentary that has been shooting for the past 18 months. Sony I shot with for a little bit in my career, mostly with the Sony FS5 and the A7R II for my Netflix original documentaries, Heroin and Recovery Boys. And I love the form factor of the FS5 and enjoyed the fact that Sony was a full frame camera compared to my GH5, which was a micro four thirds, but I never loved the image or the colors. And so as soon as the rest of the camera industry caught up with the specifications of the Sony, I ditched Sony and went back to Canon and also Red. And then Nikon I've never used until the last couple weeks. So the ZR is the first time I've ever really touched a Nikon camera, except for maybe my mom's DSLR when I was 12 years old. Brand new to Nikon, pretty excited to try it out and see how it stacks up against the rest of the pack. All right, so the categories we're going to be going through for these 4 cameras are overall features, menu system, different codecs, their color, so which camera has the best color science, overall image quality, just what I think looks the best for each of these cameras, and then IBIS, we did some tests about IBIS, and then the design and handling, how cameras function, especially for video shooters, lens selection, finally I'll touch on photography, and then we'll add up the total points to see who's the winner. The way I'm scoring this is that the best camera in each category gets 3 points, the second best gets 2 points, the third best gets 1 point, and then the last place in each category will get 0 points. Now, if you saw my video earlier this week where I put up a blind test of these 4 cameras to test the color and image quality, then you may have voted what was your favorite. So first, we'll reveal which ones are which. Camera A was the Canon R6 III, shooting in 7K RAW, 16:9. And then camera B was the Sony A7V, shooting in 4K All Intra, 10-bit 422. Camera C was the Nikon ZR, shooting in Red RAW at 6K. And then camera D was the Panasonic S1 II, shooting in 6K and ProRes RAW. And then the mystery camera was the DJI Ronin 4D, which is over my shoulder right there. And the reason I added that is, even though I've used the S1 II as my B cam to the Ronin 4D, I did want to actually check which camera system is the best B cam to the Ronin 4D. That was nice just to throw in there for my own purposes to see which of these color profiles closely matches the Ronin 4D for future reference. Now this test is testing each camera system's full frame mid-range hybrid. So the most expensive camera on this list are pretty darn close between the Panasonic S1 II, R6 III, and Sony A7V. They all come in at just under $3,000, whereas the Nikon ZR comes in at just over $2,000, so it's by far the cheapest of the bunch. But the mid-range full-frame hybrid is your sort of entry-level professional camera systems. Each camera manufacturer has cheaper models that are either APS-C or just less feature-rich full-frame cameras, but it's really these cameras where if you are making money from photography or it's a big passion of yours, same with videography, then these are maybe the ones you'd pick up that can do pretty much everything you might want them to do, but aren't that high-end $4,000, $5,000, $6,000 cameras that a lot of these camera systems have as sort of their bigger brothers. So they're great entry levels, they get everything you need to get done, but they're not breaking the bank. So that's why this range of cameras is really one of the most popular market segments. Really powerful, but still sort of affordable. So for Canon, the R6 III sits below the R5 II and is sort of the brother to the Canon C50. It is their mid-range full-frame camera that can pretty much do anything you need it to do. And that goes the same for the Sony A7V. You know, it's not the photography camera that a A1 or A9, but it is more feature-rich than some of their more affordable models. Now, the Panasonic S1 II and the Panasonic S1 II are around the same price, but they have different ethos. So the S1 II is a 44 megapixel 8K beast, and it's a beautiful camera. I love that camera. And then the S1 II is more of a high speed, so it's got a partially stacked sensor, has 24 megapixels, shoots internal RAW 6K video, and really is just a all-arounder that's a really great camera. But then the Nikon ZR is a little bit of the black sheep when it comes to this market segment. There is the Z6 and Z7 from Nikon. That series is more in line with these other cameras, but this one is definitely more video focused. So it's the first collaboration between Nikon and Red Cinema, and so that alone makes it a little bit more of a video focused camera. And it even says Z Cinema on the back, so you know it's more professional. But it also doesn't have a mechanical shutter, so photos will all be electronic shutter, which might be an issue for fast moving subjects or strange lighting or unnatural lighting. And so the ZR is definitely really trying to be something a little different, and that I think is actually one of its biggest positives, which we'll talk about later in the video. So those are the main ethos for these 4 different cameras based on the manufacturers that make them. But let's go into our first category, overall features. Because I am a filmmaker, we are taking a very video-focused approach to this video. So the first category, overall features, is really based on things like open gate, resolution, shooting modes, and then just like the intangibles like timecode or audio. So when we look at all these different cameras, we have a couple big standout features. One of them is open gate, which is a really useful feature, and I actually really like finishing films and videos in 3x2, and so I don't think it's just a throwaway thing where you can just move forward or move backward. And a lot of people shoot vertical these days, and so having an open gate option, especially in this hybrid space where I think a lot of people will be doing social media content, is a really big positive. And in that regard, you have 2 options, the Canon R6 III and the Panasonic S1 II. So these cameras both shoot open gate, and the Canon shoots in RAW in open gate, which is really cool. Whereas the Panasonic S1 II, you can only do in 10-bit 420. If you want to shoot ProRes RAW, you're going to be shooting in 16:9 or 17:9 on that camera. Now, the Nikon ZR surprisingly does not have open gate, and then the Sony A7V also does not have open gate. Resolution-wise, 3 of the cameras are very similar. We got 6K, 6K, and 7K, and then the Sony, the A7V, only has 4K recording. So even though the sensor is 33 megapixels, and so it could do 7K, just like the R6 III, which is also 33 megapixels, it does not in video mode, and instead downsamples that to 4K. One of the big things for me and for all you video shooters out there is timecode. I love having timecode on each of my cameras, and so you can always do it through the audio jack and get the noise if you're using a Tentacle or DD timecode system, but the Nikon ZR just released a firmware update that gives it timecode through the 3.5mm jack. And that means that you're actually putting timecode on the video file and not just doing the audio timecode, which is really nice to have. And that's the only camera that has true support for a timecode input. The Panasonic S1 II can do it via Bluetooth, but I have found that the Bluetooth UltraSync devices are not 100% frame accurate, and so I haven't used it a ton. If I do want to do timecode, I'll just do the audio timecode, and then the R6 III and the Sony A7V do not have any timecode support other than it just a running clock inside the camera. If you want timecode for something like the R6 III, then you have to go with the Canon C50, which is right over here. And that has a dedicated timecode port where you can actually hardwire timecode into the camera. And then for frame rates, if you are shooting at the highest resolution possible, then your best bet is going to be the Nikon ZR or the Panasonic S1 II. They both do 60 frames per second at their highest resolution, so 6K for both. Whereas for Canon, if you want 60 frames per second or 120 frames per second, then you have to go down to 4K. In its 7K modes, it can only shoot in 30 frames per second or under, so 24 to 30. And then for the Sony A7V, it only shoots 4K, but at that highest resolution, it can do all the frame rates that you would like, from 24 frames per second all the way up to 120 frames per second. And then finally, the media is all pretty similar across these cameras. The ZR, the Canon R6 III, and the S1 II all have a CF Express Type B card, and then an SD card as well. The ZR's is a micro SD, which is a little strange, but usually I just shoot to a single card of a CF Express, and that allows you to get those raw recordings. The Sony A7V also has an SD card slot, but it also has a CF Express Type A, so just basically the smaller version, but still just as fast as a CF Express Type B. So kind of a wash for that category, but it's nice to know they all have very fast cards that allows you to offload that pretty data intensive footage quickly. All right, now to go to the list, let's give out some points. It's hard to say which is the winner, but I do know who's the loser here, and sadly it is the Sony, so it gets 0 points. It doesn't have OpenGate, doesn't have a resolution higher than 4K, and just doesn't have the features that these other cameras have. I think that the Canon R6 III with OpenGate RAW is pretty interesting, but I probably have to give the win on this one to the Panasonic S1 II, just because it has so many things going for it, and so we're gonna give that one 3 points. It's got OpenGate, it's got 6K, it's got ProRes RAW, it's got timecode, albeit a not great timecode, but it does have a ton of features. So that comes down to the Canon R6 III and Nikon ZR. And while the ZR has a lot of features that I love, I think I'm going to give second place to Canon on this one, strictly for that OpenGate and OpenGate RAW. All right, next up is menu systems, and this one is obviously a little difficult for someone who's used two of these camera systems a lot, and so I know their menus really well, but there are some things that are just more intuitive than others. And as I picked up the Nikon, I was pretty incredibly surprised after never using a Nikon camera and using this one for the very first time that I could set up the entire camera exactly how I like to shoot, which is a lot of customization in just about 10-15 minutes, and then save that to a custom profile. And so I think I'm going to give the win to Nikon here. I, again, have never used it, but it was really easy to pick up and actually set it up. So Nikon gets the win in terms of their menu structure. And then between Canon and Panasonic, which I've used a lot, I think the Canon's menu system is way more intuitive. There's always some things that are just a little bit difficult to find, but usually it's set up really cleanly. And then between Lumix and Sony, I think Lumix has to win here, and it's just slightly more intuitive, easier to find things. There's not tons of menu items that are buried within menu system. And then once you sort of learn how it works, after 10-15 minutes of playing with it, it becomes easier to find the things that you actually need to find. And last place, again, sorry Sony, but their menu system is a convoluted mess, and I can't believe that it actually exists the way it does. All right, on to Codecs, and I think there's two pretty darn clear winners here, and that's the Nikon ZR and the Panasonic S1 II. I'm probably going to give the nod to the Nikon for one reason and one reason only, and that is Red RAW. And as someone who has owned a Red DSMC2 camera, the Red Helium, in the past, I owned it for about 3 years, shot a feature documentary on it called Country Brawlers, which you can watch by clicking the link in the description below on Amazon or Apple or wherever you watch your movies. I forgot how much I love red raw and red color science, and the fact that this tiny little camera has it right inside internal is pretty incredible. It also has NRAW, which is almost equally as good but much smaller file sizes, and it has ProRes RAW, and it has ProRes, and it has H.265, though the H.265 is not great. But the fact that it has 3 different RAW and ProRes means it's definitely the winner in this category. Next up would be the Panasonic S1 II. It has a whole range of incredible options, including ProRes RAW. The Canon R6 III has RAW internally as well, records directly to the CF Express card, as well as a range of 10-bit options, including all intra, long op, and everything in between. So those 3 are definitely the winners here. And again, Sony is in last place because it doesn't have any internal RAW, and all it has is either all intra or long gap in 10-bit 422 in 4K. So the winner is Nikon, another 3 points for Nikon. And then between Canon and Panasonic, it is a little more difficult. I think I'm going to give the nod to the Panasonic just because it has so many options, especially in the anamorphic space. So I'm going to go ahead and give second place to the Panasonic. And then Canon comes in third, and Sony with 0 again. Now time for the exciting categories, color and overall image quality. And so we'll head over to our Premiere Pro so we can actually look through these different shots. And so what I did here is these aren't color graded the way I would like to color grade them. Instead, I used the same LUT on every single camera, but based upon their log profile that I shot in. So I have the Buttery LUTs Master Collection, and if you don't know Buttery LUTs, they're really, really nice LUTs. They work for a lot of different applications, and there's tons of different profiles that you can choose from. But this one that I chose is just the Rec 709 Buttery LUT, which gives you a pretty good starting ground if you just wanted to color grade each clip individually from here, but it's not overly stylized. So I think it's a really good way to showcase each camera profile is giving you. And when we look at this first clip, we'll just sort of scroll through the different video files so you can see, so as I click over, sort of the difference between each one. And I think what's really interesting about this test is that individually, if you just shot with any of these cameras, I think they would all look pretty darn good. But as you scroll through them, there are some pretty wild differences between them. And I specifically wore this very colorful shirt so that we could see sort of the difference in the colors of that shirt depending on which camera I was using. So here with the Ronin 4D 8K, the red almost kind of looks more like a pink, whereas on the Panasonic S1 II, it kind of looks a little orange. So most of them have slight differences. The Nikon ZR, as I look through this, is probably the most accurate in terms of what the color of the shirt actually is. That looks like the shirt I would be normally wearing, which is, you know, a sort of a dark red. And then the Sony also is pretty accurate, I think, in terms of what the actual colors are around me, in terms of the greens and the reds that you see in this shot. And then the Canon also maybe a little orange like the Panasonic, but ultimately looks really nice. So it's tough because for color, you can kind of think of 2 different things. The first is what is the most accurate, you know, which one is actually showing the colors as they are in real life. And then the other is what is the most pleasing? What do you like to look at the most? Recently, Gerald Undone ranked sort of the most accurate colors for different cameras, and Fuji, which many people think has the nicest looking colors in image, came in last place, which I would totally agree with him on that. The Fuji colors are not accurate colors. They don't really look like real life, but they look more like an artistic expression of what you're seeing. So it's hard to judge the colors solely based on whether they are accurate or not. So this is going to be obviously a subjective opinion. So just by comparison, since the Canon C70 is filming me, and that is maybe the nicest image of a camera ever, here's the actual shirt that is in the shot. And so this will either look a lot like a Canon R6 III, or maybe will just look just like the Canon C70, and then we can see which one actually is the most color accurate. And again, nothing was added to this except for the actual LUT to Rec 709. So I didn't add any contrast or crushed any shadows or added any saturation or anything like that. The only thing I did was maybe bring it up like 0.1 or 0.2 of a stop just to even out the exposure across every frame, but that didn't change the image at all. And so in the wide shot here, they all do look quite a bit different. And the Sony A7V is by far the most saturated and contrasty right out of the gate. It's actually a very intense image. It almost kind of looks like a standard picture profile. And so I don't really love the colors coming out of the Sony. Whereas the Canon, I've just always loved Canon colors. They continue to be great, but I was really impressed with the Nikon ZR. It's definitely a bit more subdued in this test, but I've noticed that as I add color and saturation or use a more creative LUT to the Nikon ZR, it just has this in depth to the color and images that no other camera in this category, or really any other category that's not high-end cinema cameras, has. The red raw really is that rich and beautiful. And so I think for color, I'm definitely going to give the win to the Nikon ZR. And then second place, I think would have to be between the Panasonic S1 II and the Canon. When you're looking at like the leaves here, you just sort of see how sort of off the Sony colors become in certain situations. I've always thought Sony really struggles with not only skin tones, but just greens in general. And here I think that really shows up as well. Whereas the Canon, again, it looks really rich and really deep, kind of around that Nikon ZR level. And the Panasonic is also looking great, but I think I'm gonna give second place to Canon. So first place, the Nikon ZR on a hot streak. And then Panasonic is in third, Canon getting a couple more points, and Sony still shooting an over. All right, so that's color, and color is a very important part of the image, but overall image quality is something different. It's, resolution, it's what the image actually looks like and feels like. Are the colors deep, or is the image, does it have depth, and is it a robust image? Can you color grade it with some intensity? But when we look at overall image quality, then the lineup doesn't change all that much, but maybe it changes a little bit, because I do think in red raw, you still have to give the nod to the Nikon ZR. In these types of tests where you just have like 4 or 5 shots, it's sometimes hard to tell like what is the best camera system or what is the best image. But when you actually go out and shoot with all of these camera systems in a full day or on a project, then you realize that some shots and some scenarios really start to showcase a camera's strength and weaknesses. And the Nikon ZR, when I took this out on a late winter, early spring hike with my family, I was blown away by how the colors popped in that situation, whether it was, my kids' jackets or just the fresh snow on the green moss. The colors were incredible. And then the same thing when I went and just filmed a few minutes with my friend Rosalie, who is a nature illustrator and uses beautiful, vibrant watercolors. Again, the colors were so rich and so beautiful, and the image was so deep. It just became apparent that the Nikon ZR is just the best and richest image that I have ever seen outside of a high-end cinema camera from Red or Arri. And so the Nikon ZR is definitely the winner here. Unfortunately for my buddy, the Sony A7V, which I've rented for almost a month now, I took it to Zurich, I took it for Rwanda. We did 2 branded content documentary shorts for Marriott International, and we just used Sony as our walk-around cam or BTS cam. We shot it alongside the C50 and the R6 III. So we shot the main films on the 2 Canon cameras, and then the Sony was our sort of behind-the-scenes camera. And again, a lot of similar situations between the Canon and the Sony just was not nearly as nice. In a lot of scenarios, I was actually pretty amazed at how much better the Canon looked. So I think that means that the Sony is going to again be in last place. Sorry, Sony. And so second place really comes down to the Canon and the Panasonic S1 II. And while I've really enjoyed using the Lumix, when I switched to use the Panasonic for just things like this, a YouTube video, I really missed having the Canon colors and Canon image quality for things like talking head or seeing my skin tones. In some situations, especially like outdoors and daylight, the Panasonic S1 II looks really great, but it's definitely more saturated and more contrasty than I like compared to Canon. Overall image quality is going to go Nikon, Canon, Panasonic, and then the Sony. So that's color and image quality, in my opinion, the 2 most important things when it comes to actually buying a camera, especially for filmmaking and videography. But let me know in the comments below if you disagree and if you actually really like the more contrasty green image of the Sony, or perhaps think the Nikon ZR or the Canon are a little too subdued for your taste. All right, on to IBIS. And this one's gonna be short. Panasonic wins. And it's not even close. It is mind-bogglingly not close. So Panasonic gets your second victory after overall features. The IBIS on these cameras is really an incredible feat. Honestly, it's one of the main reasons I use these cameras and I continue to buy Panasonic cameras, because there's a lot of times when I just like to grab a camera, grab a nice prime lens and go out and shoot, and I want my images to be stable and not have any shakiness to them whatsoever, and that's where the Panasonic really succeeds. We'll skip the middle, second and third, and go right to last place again, and I've always disliked Sony's IBIS, and I have once again been kind of blown away at how I've noticed that it's just not very good. So again, Sony gets last place, and I'm really not trying to be a Sony hater. Like, I thought of actually making an entirely new video to just talk about that I rented a Sony A7V just to see if the hype that everyone talks about with Sony cameras has really improved since I generally figured out that, oh, I don't like their image or how they function or their menu systems back in 2019. But no, I would say that the Sony in general is really struggling in a lot of these tests, and I do reserve the ability to change my mind at any moment. If Sony puts out an FX3 II that has internal NDs, I will strongly consider trying it out again. But as of right now, again, Sony is still lagging behind in a lot of these tests, and its IBIS is just a little bit shaky. You know, things that I do with my Canons and my Lumixes where I just hand hold a shot as if it's like a tripod, the Sony still struggles. You can still see the jitters, you can still see some quick movements with the IBIS, and I've tried the different settings and nothing really seems to help and make it all that much better. So the Sony is in last place. So that comes down to second place between the Canon and the Nikon. Now, the Canon at wide angle lenses does have a little too much wobble for my taste, but I often don't do crazy stuff with my IBIS. What I really want it for is to put on my Zeiss Otis 50mm and just do some over the shoulders of two people talking during a documentary or branded content shoot. And for that, the Canon is really good. I think the Nikon is very similar to Canon. It does definitely have a little bit more general shakiness than the Canon does. So I'm gonna give second place to Canon and third place to Nikon. All right, now up to design and handling of the actual cameras themselves. And there are sort of three different design ethos within these four cameras. The first is that two of them are very photography focused, and that is the Canon and the Sony. They just have a button layout that is definitely made for photographers, and obviously videographers can make it work, but it's a photography first design. The Nikon ZR, on the other hand, I don't think cares about photographers at all. It just wants to be a video guy. So it's pretty video focused and definitely has a more minimalist design. There's not nearly the amount of buttons that I think photographers demand. And then the Panasonic S1 II is somewhere in between, where it does have the design ethos of a photography lens on the back, but up top, the different switches definitely feel more video focused. So with that, let's look at the photography focused cameras first. This is the Sony A7. It definitely has a lot of buttons, a lot of customizability, which is nice. I really like the C1, C3, and C2. They're just nicely placed, and they're all programmable, which is really nice. And then if you are an autofocus person, you know, you do have sort of those beautiful AF on buttons, but it doesn't have quite the amount of switches I would like. I really like switching my manual focus and autofocus points on the body itself rather on the lens. Not a huge deal, but the Panasonic version of that I use quite a bit. I'll show you that in a second. And then it has the custom modes 1, 2, 3 up here. I really like a custom dial like that. I really didn't like when Canon changed the R5 to click mode and then use a wheel to go to a different custom mode and then select. I just want to snap that over as quickly as I can, because 1 for my custom modes is always my standard 24 frames per second picture shooting. Click to 2 to use a 60 frames per second or slow motion, and then 3 for a maybe even faster slow motion or open gate or something like that. So really nice to have that on there. The Canon is not much different. It has those custom modes, and then the back is similar. What I don't love about the Canon is a lot of the buttons seem a little random. You can program a lot of them, but they're kind of small, a little harder to press and find. There's no pressing on the D-pad, so you lose 4 customizable buttons, which for videographers I think is a pretty big deal, because, you know, like things like focus peaking and zebras, I like to turn those on and off, or even my LUT view assist, I turn those off all the time on my cinema cameras and on my Lumix cameras, and so it's nice to have a few extra customizable buttons. And then the Lumix has less going on back here, so there's less chance you're gonna push random little buttons over here, which I do quite a bit actually on my Canon. I love this single shot, continuous, and manual focus switch on the back. if I am shooting on a gimbal or shooting myself while I'm doing a video. The fact that I can hit continuous and then go back to manual focus, which I do a lot, really quickly is very nice. And then again, love the D-pad, love that there's 4 more customizable buttons, comfy joystick. But the best thing about the Lumix cameras is these 3 buttons right up here. They're all in a row. I feel like with Canon and Sony, but especially Canon, they just kind of scatter buttons in random places. But I like to have all my buttons right in a row, nice and organized, and the Panasonic does that really nicely. And they're white balance, which I change all the time doing video, ISO, which sometimes I'll change, and then you can customize this button however you want. In photo, I love having exposure compensation because I'm often shooting in aperture priority. And then I also love that these dials are also lockable on the Panasonic. And so really nice design to lock those down so you don't accidentally click off of C1 if you're in your main shooting modes. And then it also has an S&Q mode on the side, which is great. So you have those dials to go from photo, video, and S&Q. And most of the cameras have sort of a photo and video switch to toggle back and forth. And Canon has done a really good job of implementing that when they first did it with the R5C and the C50, and it's become quicker and quicker. And then Sony also has an S&Q mode as well on their dial. Now the 2 best screen designs by far are this beautiful pull out from Panasonic. And so it can be flush to the body. You can also pull it out and it stays flat with the body, so it's not sticking out over here on the side, but you can also move it so you can get high shots or low shots. And then if you want to flip it all the way out, then you can do that as well. But I really like having my screen that is centered with the body, especially on a gimbal, or even when I'm shooting or have, using the ports over here for HDMI or audio or headphones, which I always am when I'm shooting video, which again is nice because you can get it away from those ports, even if you're doing the flip out section. And so this implementation is probably the best screen implementation I have ever seen. And Sony just went ahead and was like, well, okay, yeah, we'll do that too. Maybe they did it first. I can't remember. Someone did it. I'm pretty sure the S1H was the first camera that allowed you to do both. But the Sony points for having that as well. And then the Canon, disappointingly, only has the flip and tilt, which again gets in the way of ports a lot. I'm hitting my HDMI cable. I'm hitting my USB-C cable. It's annoying. And then finally, the design of the Nikon ZR is sort of the big difference. There are just not that many buttons. There's one tiny little joystick, and there's only 3 buttons up here. When I was shooting with a Arri Alexa Mini, they only have 3 buttons on that camera as well, and you're supposed to do a lot of things with the viewfinder that comes with the camera, but that viewfinder sucked, and I wanted to put my own monitor on it, and I didn't want the extra weight of that heavy viewfinder on there, so I programmed that entire camera to function with just 3 buttons, and I was able to do it. Every once in a while, if I really needed to change frame rates, this was for a feature documentary, so we were shooting at 24 frames per second 90% of the time, I'd have to pull up my phone, open the app, and change it, which took a few seconds, but I was able to program those 3 buttons. And so for the Nikon ZR, I actually really like the minimalist design. All of these other cameras have just tons and tons of buttons, and I actually prefer having a lot less going on my camera body, so I can do my 3 or 4 most used buttons and then can use the menu for everything else. The Nikon ZR sadly does not have an unbelievable screen implementation like the S1 II and the Sony A7V, but it does have the greatest screen I've ever seen in my life. This 4-inch beauty is honestly one of the best things to come to the mirrorless hybrid space in a long time. The only thing I can think of that would be better is something like internal NDs. I really don't like using external monitors. I like my camera to be stripped down, and I can't stand the fact that some of these screens are so small and so puny and just at 3 inches and not that bright. And so as soon as I picked this camera up and started shooting with it, I was blown away by this screen. Absolutely blown away. And so though I think I like the general body design and grip and just general feel of the Panasonic cameras, I'm going to give the win to the Nikon ZR because of this screen. I also like that if you did take the cage off, if you didn't want this grip, if you wanted it really stripped down, you could do that as well. But it's the screen that really, really makes the Nikon ZR the best designed camera for videographers out of this little bunch. To the points, we got to give design and handling the win to the Nikon ZR solely for that 4-inch screen. It's incredible, but I do like the minimalist design as well. And then second place goes to the Panasonic S1 II. It's just easier from a filmmaking standpoint to find the settings you need and customize the buttons. And I also just love the way Panasonic cameras look and feel. They're definitely more utilitarian and less curvy and plasticky than some of the other cameras. And so really like this design as well. And then between the Canon and the Sony, they're very similar. The Sony is a little smaller, has some sharper edges. I don't love the way the grip feels, and the body is feels a little cheap compared to especially the Panasonic and the Nikon, but the Canon doesn't feel all that much better, honestly, so I can't give them too many points for that. But I think because the screen implementation is so much better on the Sony and the button layout is a little more sensical, Sony gets its first point. Woo! 1 point to Sony, and Canon puts up its first 0. Sorry, Canon. However, Canon does have a little trick. It's that if you don't like the R6 III design but want pretty much the exact same camera, then you can just buy the Canon C50, and that design is perfect because it's made for filmmakers. But you lose IBIS and a mechanical shutter. So, but you gain timecode and fans. All right, next up is lens selection. This one will be pretty quick and easy. Sony by far has the most options when it comes to E-mounts. They've had the E-mount a lot longer than any of these other mounts, and so therefore have put out a lot more lenses and have tons of third-party support, especially from Zeiss and Sigma, which are two of the best lens manufacturers out there today. And then Canon has a closed system, so the RF mount is really just Canon lenses, and while Canon does put out a lot of lenses, and they have some incredible lenses like the 24-105 f2.8 IS that's filming me on the C50 right over here, or their VCM primes, or their 7200 f2.8, a lot of beautiful lenses, but most of them are very expensive, and there's just not nearly the amount that you have for Sony. Now, Panasonic and the L mount is pretty interesting because the L mount Alliance has tons of lenses as well. Panasonic is pretty slow with lens developments. I think they only put out like 2 a year and really don't have any of the higher end primes in the 1.4 or 1.2 range. They have the standard f2.8 zooms, are still lacking a 16 to 35, but Sigma is part of the L mount Alliance and really fills in all the gaps. And then if you want the really high end lenses, Leica is also part of that L mount Alliance. So tons of options for the L mounts. And then Nikon, I originally thought, oh, there's not that many Z-mount lenses. They have some third-party support, but not nearly the amount that Sony and Lumix does. But because of this little adapter, and as you might be able to tell, it can take any E-mount lens. That is wild. And so therefore, not only do you get all of the Nikon Z-mount lens options, but anything the Sony can put on its body, you can put on the Nikon ZR. So with just this tiny, almost nothing adapter, you can put on any Sony E-mount lens, or any lens that has an E-mount like this Zeiss Loxia. So though I thought the Sony was going to win this hands down, but once I realized that you can take any E-mount lens and put it on Nikon, as well as get all the Nikon Z-mount options, then the Nikon Z actually has the greatest lens selection. Now, if you're a big autofocus person, I believe the autofocus and features of some of the Sony lenses and native lenses to E-mount function a little bit better than they do with the third-party adapters on the Nikon Z, so you could also give the win to Sony. And because Sony doesn't have any other wins, to break the tie, I will give Sony its first win for lens selection with the Nikon ZR right on its heels. And then Panasonic would have to come in third place, and because Canon has a closed mount and only has Canon lenses, then Canon is coming in last place. Now, obviously, this has been a video-focused video, but all of these cameras do really excellent photos as well. And I think it's pretty clear that the Sony and the Canon at 33 megapixels with their incredible autofocus system are going to be the best cameras for photos. And so because I like the Canon image better, I'm going to give that the top honors, with the Sony in second place. And then Panasonic with its 24 megapixels is going to come in third place. Its autofocus has really improved over past iterations of Panasonic cameras. And then the Nikon ZR is going to come in last place, strictly because it does not have a mechanical shutter, and so therefore it's electronic shutter only, which might result in some rolling shutter artifacts and also maybe some weird banding in different lighting. So I could keep talking about all of these cameras forever and ever, but this video would become like 5 hours long. And so there are some things I did not touch on that I'll quickly just run through. The first one for video shooters is overheating. Now, it's notoriously been a problem for the Panasonic S1 II and S1R II, and I have a couple videos on this channel showcasing how I got these cameras to not overheat and all the different workarounds I did. But then Panasonic put out a firmware update that greatly extends the recording times of both of those cameras, and so it's less of an issue, but the S1 II, as far as I can tell, has the most issue with overheating. Next up is the Canon R6 III. I have not been able to get it to overheat yet, and I've recorded for hours and hours and hours, but those have not been in very hot environments because it's been winter here in Appalachia, and I've also traveled abroad where it was not that hot. And then the Nikon ZR, again, haven't had enough time with it to really put it through a stress test, but there are a lot of tests online you can find, and nobody has been able to overheat that camera either, and so that's a good point for the ZR. And then the Sony, I think, is pretty robust on the fact that it does not overheat as well, even though it doesn't have any external fans. Connectivity and functionality, all of these cameras in the back here, everything but the ZR, have full-size HDMIs, which is really nice. So if you do use an external monitor, those cameras will be a lot easier to use. The Nikon ZR does have a micro HDMI, so you can use an external monitor, but that screen is so awesome that I'm not sure you would ever really need to or want to. The only problem with this screen as of right now is that there is no focus peaking in red RAW, which is very annoying, but it does have a really nice focus box that turns green when you are in focus on your subject. And speaking of that and some intangibles, the Canon R6 III for manual focus shooters like myself, who's using the Zeiss Otis series often, the focusing assist box on the Canon cameras is just the best manual focus implementation I've ever seen. And even though you're using a manual focus lens, it can also do eye detect. So if you're pointing at a human, the box just won't be center framed, or you move your joystick, it'll jump to someone's eye. And so while you're focusing, that box, which is white, we'll see two little markers get closer and closer and closer together and then turn green when you have it in focus. And that is honestly one of the main reasons I still use Canon cameras, because I love that focus box. Sony's peaking is awful, really just honestly bad, and it doesn't have a focus box that I could find. Again, the menus are so convoluted, maybe it's in there, but I found it very difficult to focus with the different manual focus lenses that I like. And it was pretty funny because I took this camera out and shot with the Zeiss Otis and was thinking, oh, I love the Zeiss Otis 50mm, it's so sharp as long as you get it in focus. And I thought I was getting a bunch of images in focus, but the peaking wasn't great, and so everything was just a little bit out of focus, which never happened on my R6 III. Now, I could have put this in the overall features, but one thing I do want to touch on is audio. The Nikon ZR, again, takes the cake because it has 32-bit float internally, and the Panasonic S1 II is a close second because it also has 32-bit float, but you have to put on the Panasonic XLR module. Now, you can get XLR modules with these two cameras, the Canon and the Sony, if you have the Tascam XLR unit, but it's just kind of a cumbersome unit. I don't really particularly like it, and so I'd rather either just get a C50 or use the C50 if I was really needing audio in a Canon camera, and then the Panasonic XLR implementation is just a lot better. All right, with all that said, let's add up our total points and see who is the winner. First up is the Canon R6 III. It won photos. It only won one category, pretty amazingly, but it got second a lot. So we click sum. So 14 points for the Canon R6 III. All right, next up is the Sony, and it had a lot of zeros, so I can't imagine it's gonna get anywhere near that. And it got 6 points, so quite a bit behind the Canon. And the Nikon really pulled it through during that video quality section, and so I think with 19 points, it has taken the lead over the Canon. And finally, the Panasonic S1 II. Let's see if it can pull out second place. 15 points. So there you go. Surprisingly, actually, I really thought as I started this video that the Canon or the Nikon would be first, but the Nikon clearly pulled ahead, and I really thought Canon would be second place after I started putting down the different categories. But it was the Panasonic S1 II that got second place, but just by a hair. And I think when it comes down to it, the Nikon ZR wins based on the fact that it's kind of trying to rethink what a small video camera should be. These are photo cameras, and they're like, we have great video. But the Nikon's like, who cares about photos? Video is where it's at. It is the future, and they bought Red to prove it, and then they built out the Nikon ZR to be a video camera beast, and just this 4-inch monitor alone is reason enough for me to want to buy one. But not only is that screen and the design implementation so nice to use, it also has the best image, and that is the most important. That Red RAW or the NRAW is just an absolutely beautiful codec. It edits back so smooth, and the colors are richer and more beautiful than anything else I've shot that's not called a red helium or an Arri Alexa Mini. And so I really do have to give the nod to Nikon for this camera. And one category I did not have is the value category, and at $2,000, this camera is by far the best value for video shooters compared to the other mid-range hybrids. It is just the most feature-rich and most beautiful image and most beautiful color that you can get anywhere near its price point. Should get a little stand. So there you go, a full test and rundown of all of these mid-range hybrids, mostly for filmmaking and video. Let me know in the comments below if you disagree with the results, especially when it comes to image quality and color, or if there's any of the features you've seen in these cameras that should dock some points or actually add some points to their total score. And if you like videos like this, consider becoming a member of the channel, where I have a 90-minute documentary interview lighting course, as well as tons of members-only videos, footage, and more comparisons like this one. So consider clicking join below. Otherwise, comment, like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next video.